Last Wednesday, Governor Ralph Northam signed a landmark bill banning the death penalty. The new law makes Virginia the 23rd state and the first of the old Confederate states to ban the death penalty completely. Since its first execution in 1608, Virginia has executed close to 1,400 people, more than any other state in the Union. In today's times, Virginia is second only to Texas in the number of people executed, so why such a historic shift, and why now? Sue Goodwin reports.
Virginia's anti-death penalty activists have been fighting for an end to capital punishment for decades, so news of last week's bill signing is surely seen as a moment of celebration, but also some surprise that it happened as soon as it did. Michael Stone is the executive director of Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, an organization that first formed 30 years ago to advocate for an end to state-sponsored killing in Virginia. He describes the moment he first realized that it was actually going to happen. That was back in January, when the news broke that Governor Northam would use an upcoming address to call for abolition.
1 week before the start of the 2021 General Assembly session, our organization's lobbyist called me at 6 o'clock just before dinner one night and asked, "Are you sitting down?" and told me that the governor's staff had contacted her saying that he wanted to endorse death penalty abolition in his State of the Commonwealth address the following night, and could we provide pieces of information that he could use in his speech. So Virginia and I put that material together, got it off to the governor's staff, and virtually all of it appeared in his speech the following night.
Michael Stone says he didn't expect this moment to actually happen for 3 to 5 years, but that endorsement from Northam back in January was enough to push it over the top and get the bill passed through both legislative chambers and onto the governor's desk for a signature. But it was far from the only factor that moved this movement to a victory. Stone says the work of the faith community has long been at the center of the death penalty abolition movement in Virginia. An important shift, he says, is that in recent years a number of unexpected allies have joined the movement, including the attorneys who are elected to prosecute crimes on behalf of the state.
In Virginia, we elect our prosecutors by locality, and they're called Commonwealth's attorneys. And in the election of 2017 and 2019, many old-time pro-death penalty Commonwealth's attorneys were defeated or retired. And in their stead were a group of younger, more progressive prosecutors who ran on platforms of either promising never to seek the death penalty or, if they would, to only do it rarely instead of a matter of course. And so we had 12 Commonwealth's attorneys sign an open letter to the General Assembly calling for death penalty abolition. And together, they represented nearly half the population of the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Another essential element of this movement, Michael Stone says, are the voices of victims' families, people who are victimized themselves by a violent crime but do not want to see the death penalty pursued in the deaths of their loved ones.
We had a group of 21 victim family members write an open letter to the General Assembly calling on them to end the death penalty, saying that capital punishment did not help them, but in fact harmed victim family members. And one of the most powerful spokespeople in testimony was Rachel Sutphin, the daughter of Montgomery County Sheriff's Deputy Corporal Sutphin, who was killed by Will Morva. And Rachel made a private and public plea to then Governor McAuliffe to spare Morva's life because of his severe mental illness and delusions. But the governor never responded to Rachel, and he allowed the execution to go on.
Making Will Morva the last person executed in Virginia. Yet another shift in Virginia's abolition movement that Michael Stone says has been absolutely critical is the deepening recognition that the death penalty is an issue of racial justice, one that reaches deep into American history.
The death penalty and racial oppression have been tied together since the earliest days of the Republic. Death has always been a tool of racial terror and racial control, whether it be through official state-sanctioned killing or through lynching. And the research clearly shows an overwhelming racial bias in application of the death penalty throughout our history.
In fact, in 1848, that racial bias was actually codified into law.
In 1848, the Virginia General Assembly passed a law that black people could be executed for any crime for which a white person would receive a sentence of 3 years or more. So even the code made explicit the racial bias in application of the death penalty.
Data from the Death Penalty Information Center offers a picture of the impact of that law. From 1900 until 1977, Virginia executed 73 black men on charges of rape, attempted rape, or robbery, while no white defendants were executed for these same crimes. But even after the 1848 law was declared unconstitutional, racial discrimination in the application of the death penalty in Virginia persisted. Though Virginia is about 20% African American, black inmates have accounted for 46% of the 114 people who have been executed statewide since 1976. And it's not just the race of the perpetrator that perpetuated this bias.
Since 1976, the primary distinction is race of victim. In Virginia, for example, defendants were 3 times more likely to be sentenced to death in cases where the victim was white than if the victim was any other race.
Now, death penalty opponents have long pointed to capital punishment's racial bias as the reason to abolish it. But Michael Stone says 2 things happened that finally pushed Virginia in that direction. One was the scandal over a racist photo of Governor Northam in a 1984 yearbook that sparked calls for him to resign. Stone believes that outcry forced Northam to be more sensitive to racial justice. But it wasn't until the police murder of George Floyd and the ensuing public outrage over massive racial disparities in our criminal justice system that the movement to repeal the death penalty in Virginia truly gained traction.
Legislators who had expressed support for death penalty abolition before then, they were kind of lukewarm about it. Yeah, we'll get around to it, but it was not a pressing priority by any means, even among Democrats. But all criminal justice reform issues were elevated dramatically after the emergence of an incredibly strong Black Lives Matter movement in the wake of the George Floyd murder and the police murders of other unarmed black people.
So what's next? Speaking to the Washington Post last week, Michael Stone made this statement, quote, "One lesson we learned from other states is that the most dangerous time is the first year or 2 after a victory," unquote. And here's what he meant by that.
That is when the victory is most vulnerable to being reversed. For example, in Nebraska, a Republican legislature voted to abolish the death penalty. The Republican governor vetoed it, and then that same Republican legislature overrode that veto. But in that state, referenda are allowed under the state constitution, so the governor immediately poured a few $1 million into a referendum campaign to get the question on the ballot, and the voters reversed the decision of the legislature there so that death penalty abolition never took effect.
Stone says it's important to make sure the same thing doesn't happen in Virginia, where Republicans remain largely unified in opposition to death penalty abolition, and where in 2022 the state will elect a new governor, and every 100 members of the House of Delegates is up for re-election.
So in 9 months, it's possible that we will have a pro-death penalty governor and a House Speaker who is pro-death penalty. And with a narrow margin in the Senate, I would not be surprised if that happens, that there will be an effort to reinstate the death penalty in Virginia next year.
So what does that mean for Michael Stone's organization, Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty? They could decide to close their doors, given how hard it is to raise money for an organization whose mission has been accomplished, or they could stay open to defend the victory and even broaden their mission to work on other criminal justice issues.
So our board's going to be making that decision in about a month from now. But even if we decide to close our doors, the ACLU of Virginia, the Virginia Catholic Conference, and the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy will certainly work to defend that victory, because they have all been key allies of ours through the years in the abolition fight.
Michael Stone, Executive Director of Virginians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. For Monday Morning QB, I'm Sue Goodwin.